Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we saw how Mal must have been really proud of all he accomplished creatively with the Beatles and Neil and others, and it was regarding Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He helped to get the cover of the album made. He helped Paul create 2 songs. He played instruments. He felt a part of the creative process. But then he learned that not only was he not giving credit on the 2 songs he helped to create, but he wasn't going to get any royalties on them either. So that must have hurt. Mal had a lot of creative talents, and it seems each time he tried to express his ideas, nothing seemed to work out. So let's see what's happening today. Mal and Paul would spend a few hours on a layover at Paris's Orly Airport. Mal and Paul made a long flight to the American West Coast. This is something that Mal enjoyed. He liked the deep camaraderie and the idea of being indispensable all at the same time. The journey took 24 hours. They arrived in Los Angeles on the evening of April 3rd. They had a delay because Paul had some visa issues. After that, according to Mal, they had a casual stroll to our awaiting Learjet and a hi-ho for San Francisco, where we would saunter atop Nob Hill. When they arrived in San Francisco, it was unexpectedly chilly, including the Bay Area's first snowfall in 42 years. They were tourists and they had a small amount of time and were on a mission. Mal said, Paul and I went shopping, buying records and taking pictures of the famous Golden Gate Bridge. And then it was off to observe a Jefferson Airplane rehearsal at the Fillmore Auditorium. That February, the band had released their surrealistic Pillow LP, complete with standout tracks as Somebody to Love and White Rabbit. Guitarist Marty Balin would never forget the moment that Mal made his entrance. We were sitting there playing at the old Fillmore, and in comes this guy, Mal, suit and tie, and we're all hippies out. In a formal tone, Mal announced that Master Paul McCartney would like to meet you. And flabbergasted, Balin replied, "Oh, well, send him in." In truth, Balin didn't know if this guy was real or a joke. So he went out, and in comes Paul. Afterwards, Paul joined Balin and bassist Jack Cassidy at their Oak Street apartment for an impromptu jam session, while Mal stood in the doorway snapping photographs of this mid-60s rock and roll summit. The Britons smoked some weed with their new North American friends, during which Paul produced an acetate of Sgt. Pepper, which he was eager to share with the likes of Balin and Cassidy, if not the world. And then Mal and Paul were off on yet another Learjet ride, this time to Denver, where the Old Vic Theater Company was on a brief hiatus from its North American tour of Romeo and Juliet. The two were met in Denver by Associated Sports writer Burt Rosenthal, who had lent Paul his house for the duration of his stay. Meanwhile, Mal booked himself a room at the nearby Driftwood Motel. As Mal was getting ready for Jane Asher's surprise birthday party that evening at a swanky Denver hotel, he got a call from Paul. He was nervous about the security at his borrowed lodgings, so Mal got a taxi and went over. Mal said, "I gave it a twice over," then arranged to meet Paul and Jane at the hotel entrance, getting the pair of them in without any hassle, but quite a few photographers, including our old friend Harry Benson, followed the birthday cake in. It was a delightful party, the Old Vic Company really mixing, and we had a right old do. The roadie managed to photobomb a few of the shots, awkwardly leaning across the dinner table as Jane admired her birthday cake. Sounds like Mal was anxious to get into the picture. The next day, Mal enjoyed the most memorable day of his American jaunt. Jane was driving, and she, Mal, and Paul found themselves in the heart of the Rocky Mountains. For the Liverpudlians, the experience made for a real magical mystery trip, pulling off the road and parking amongst the so-green trees, walking down a rocky gorge to a tinkling river, which was to take us for a ride to Wonderland, Mal recalled. It was a warm, lazy day, and so we finding it strange to walk through snow which lay around in twinkling confusion, treading the virgin whiteness with naked feet, as many reincarnations of man must have done before us. Mal took plenty of pictures, including a picture of the young couple looking coy during a private moment on their hike in the Rockies. And that afternoon, Mal couldn't resist taking a plunge into the icy river for a bracing swim. That night, Jane prepared a meal for the 3 of them in Rosenthal's kitchen. Mal and Paul were curious over a concept they had hatched in the Rockies earlier that day. Paul came up with the idea of making a Beatles home movie of sorts. Mal wrote, "The idea going at that moment is for some sort of mystery tour where everybody boards a coach with no idea of their destination. The tentative title being Roll In for the Mystery Tour. This develops over our stay, and Magical Mystery Tour is born. The magic giving us free rein to do all the silly things we wanted to." And together they hatched the concept of Share-a-Bang Trip. In Paul's memory, when we were kids, you'd get on a bus and you didn't know where you were going, but nearly always it was Blackpool. From Liverpool, it was inevitably Blackpool, and everyone would go, "Ooh, it was Blackpool after all." Everyone would spend the time guessing where they were going, and this was part of the thrill. And we remembered those. With the concept in place, Paul suggested that the television movie mimicked the acid-soaked activities of author Ken Kesey and merry pranksters who had embarked upon a cross-country journey of the States in a vintage International Harvester school bus arrayed in psychedelic colors. The next day, as Jane starred in a matinee performance for the Old Vic, Mal and Paul went exploring. They did sightseeing around the old Boodle mine and got their rental car stuck in the mud that had accompanied the spring thaw. Mal at one point took a picture of Paul sunning himself on the hood of the car. That night, they ate dinner at Paul's Cafe, an irresistible choice, of course, for the two men. Afterwards, they had a few drinks at the Gilded Garter. As Paul and Mal watched the performance of a local band, the lead vocalist asked, "Are you two folk singers? I know your faces from somewhere." "Maybe I look like a country singer," Mal wrote. The following morning, I phoned for a cab in order to pick Jane up and take her to the airport, leaving Paul asleep. But the manager of the hotel I was staying in wouldn't let me leave without paying the bill. Maybe I also looked unscrupulous. Before they left Colorado, the duo drove out to the Red Rocks, the spectacular amphitheater on Denver's western outskirts, where the Beatles had performed during their first American tour in August 1964. After, Paul stopped to sign a few autographs, and they visited a local Native American trading post before catching a flight to Los Angeles. Mal was pleased with the experience, writing that we left Denver in Frank Sinatra's Learjet, which he very kindly loaned us, a beautiful job with black leather upholstery, and to our delight, a well-stocked bar. They were met at the airport by Derek Taylor, who was now handling PR for the Beach Boys and other West Coast rockers, and his wife, Joan. Mal and Paul had missed Derek considerably, his urbane wit and inherent goodwill. They enjoyed hanging around the Taylor's swimming pool and playing with the couple's daughters. Derek was happy to hear that things were looking up in the Beatles camp, particularly for the members of their inner circle. They seemed to be a very tight sixth group now in England, the four Beatles and Malcolm and Neil. That's what Derek recalled. And Mal and Neil were also involved creatively, suggesting things and being listened to. With their touring days seemingly behind them, at least for the foreseeable future, the group appeared to have found a working routine, which pleased Derek to no end. Mal said that life had never been easier for him, that the Beatles were absolutely beautiful to be near, and that there were no rows, no irritability, no put-downs, and no boredom, he wrote. Everyone is just doing sort of little things that they want to do. Everyone has their own thing, whatever that means. That's what he said. During their last night in L.A., Mal and Paul went over to Michelle and John Phillips' Beverly Hills home, where they sat around sipping wine. At one point, Paul left for a Beach Boys recording session. After several hours had passed and many bottles were emptied, McCartney returned with Brian Wilson. Before the roadie knew it, Michelle and John had produced a variety of instruments for the impromptu hoedown. Mal played guitar on top of Old Smoky, with Paul trying his hand at cello and later the flugelhorn. To Mal's chagrin, Brian put a damper on the spontaneity of the whole affair by walking in with a tray of water-filled glasses, trying to arrange it into some sort of session. After they were returning to the United Kingdom, Paul was preoccupied with the idea of working on a new project. At one point, he borrowed a notepad from a flight attendant and began composing the lyrics for Magical Mystery Tour. As Mal looked on, Paul started drafting a rough schema for the movie, a circle divided into 8 segments to accommodate a 60-minute television program. When they arrived back in London, we were surprised to see a whole crowd of photographers, Mal recalled, but they were waiting for Oscarless Lynn Redgrave, who had irritated me somewhat by her laughing and shouting on the plane on the way over. I stayed as close to Paul as I possibly could, Mal added, although his efforts had nothing to do with protecting the Beatles' safety. Rather, they were a clumsy attempt to ensure that he was photographed along with such A-listers as McCartney and Redgrave. He tried as hard as he possibly could, but Paul still got photographed by himself. Once Paul and Mal got back to England, there was plenty of activity back. On April 19th, NIMS engineered a solution to the Beatles' looming tax problems by overseeing the formation of Beatles and Company, replacing the Beatles Limited, which had been formed in June 1963. This new entity counted for 4 principals: John, Paul, George, and Ringo, along with Mal and Neil. With the creations of Beatles and Company, the band would not only stave off massive loss of their existing capital to the Inland Revenue, the UK version of the IRS, but also ensure that their earnings were channeled back into their new legal partnership, which in turn would be taxed at a lower corporate rate. It was a masterstroke of business acumen, but the Beatles had a much bigger game in mind, and it was right there, hidden in plain sight, on the back cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club's Band, the apple. On April 21st, Mal, Neil, and the Beatles were back at EMI Studios to apply one last flourish to the Sgt. Pepper LP, a coda that consisted of only a few seconds, yet required an all-night session to produce. Barry Miles later recalled that during the marathon session, the Beatles stood around 2 microphones, singing snatches of songs and yelling for what seemed like hours, with the rest of us standing around joining in. Mal carried in cases of Coke and bottles of scotch. Ringo was out of it. "I'm so stoned," he said, "I think I'm going to fall over." As he slowly toppled, Mal caught him and propped him neatly in a chair without a murmur. In the control room, no one seemed to notice. At John's suggestion, Martin appended the sound of a dog whistle, an 18 kilocycle note that would be largely inaudible to humans. While Martin and Emmerich engaged in post-production duties for Sgt. Pepper, the boys turned their attention to a pair of projects, including Magical Mystery Tour, which Paul would shortly unveil, and a feature-length cartoon based upon Revolver's Yellow Submarine. Both projects would require new Beatles music, with the former calling for Mal and the bandmates to take on the guise of filmmakers. For the Yellow Submarine animated film, which is being developed by King Features Syndicate, the band was tasked with delivering new material, a string of songs mostly rejects in the Beatles' minds that over the next several months grew to include It's All Too Much, All Together Now, Hey Bulldog, and Only a Northern Song, a holdover from Sgt. Pepper Sessions. Magical Mystery Tour was a different story altogether, having already been slated by Paul as a natural follow-up to Sgt. Pepper. As John later recalled, Paul set the Magical Mystery Tour up and had worked it out with Mal Evans, and then he came and showed me what his idea was, the story and how he had it all, the production and everything. George and I were sort of grumbling, effing movie, oh well, we better do it. At first, Magical Mystery Tour was slow to get underway, which was not uncommon, as the group shifted gears into a new project. Beatles sessions were always very hectic for the first few days, I think due to the fact that everybody was a little nervous about getting in the studio again after a break, Mal recalled, and they certainly kept me hopping. I would get requests from the 4 of them to do 6 different things at one time, and it was always a case of relying on instinct and experience and awarding priorities. They used to be right sods for the first few days, until they realized that everything was going to go smoothly and they could get into the routine of recording again. With Magical Mystery Tour, Mal was especially eager to trace the project's progress, particularly given his role in its gestation. On the April 25th session, Mal was acting as Paul's assistant while he was working out the lyrics for the Magical Mystery Tour track. That evening, Hunter Davies observed as Paul played the opening bars on the piano as Mal Evans wrote down the title in a schoolboy hand. Paul said, "Trumpets. Yes, they have some trumpets. A fanfare to go with roll up for the Magical Mystery Tour." Mal had better write that down. It was the only line they had. Paul also told Mal to write down D-A-E, the first 3 chords of the song. Mal sucked his pencil and waited, but nothing more came. That night, the boys recorded the song's basic tracks, with Mal and Neil chipping in with percussion, including Mal reprising his role on the cowbell. Afterwards, Paul invited his mates to try their hand at free association to complete the lyrics for Magical Mystery Tour. Earlier in the day, Paul asked Mal to go to London bus stations and find posters advertising mystery trips, hoping that they might borrow phrases that could be used in the song. But he couldn't find anything. Mal came back empty-handed. This forced Paul to improvise. Paul said, "Just sing out any words and phrases that you can think of. Not, of course, any words, but stuff that might be shouted out by somebody wanting to roll up and go on a coach ride, such as invitation, reservation, satisfaction guaranteed." That same week, Mal and Neil joined the Beatles at the Bag, where the roadies were charged with ferreting out possible items for the coach show, they recalled. Basically, it was agreed that the plan should be all-inclusive, not exclusive. This meant trying to fit into the show something for everyone, as wide a variety as possible. So April was coming to a close, and Mal's family joined him at the 40-house lodgings he shared with Neil. The family weekend in London wasn't without its traumas, though. On Sunday, Lil answered a knock at the door and came face-to-face with Victoria Munsey, a cub reporter for the Teen Life and one of Mal's American pen pals. Oh boy. Now 17, Victoria was in town with her father Dick, the Kansas City physician. They were ostensibly to audition for a drama school, although in truth she had just wanted to see London and Mal. In a recent letter to her, Mal had scheduled a visit for Monday, presumably after his family had returned to Liverpool. Father and daughter were staying at nearby Carlton Tower on Sloane Street, only a block or so away from 40 House. Victoria was anxious to see Mal, thinking to herself, "Why don't you just go pop by and say hello?" So I knocked on the door, and his wife opens the door, and I was really shocked because I didn't know he had a wife. And he came to the door and he said, "My family is visiting this weekend from Liverpool." In a kind of stunned shock, Victoria beat a hasty retreat, promising to see him the next day. Naturally, she had plenty of questions, namely, "Why didn't you tell me you were married?" And he said, "It's different in England." To her teenage mind, Mal's excuse sounded reasonable. "Okay, that makes sense to me," she thought. "It's a cultural thing." That week, she hung out most every day with Mal at 40 House, where she started to see scraps of paper around with song lyrics on them, and that was the first time that I knew he was actually helping contribute to some of their songs. At night, Victoria and her father enjoyed a meal at Alvaro, an exclusive eatery on King's Road that catered to the rich and famous. The chef and proprietor, Alvaro Maxioni, was the cultural toast of swinging London. Mal had provided Victoria with an unlisted telephone number that allowed her to gain entrance to the restaurant there, where, in her memory, Alvaro kept the curtains drawn as if it was some kind of speakeasy. "My dad and I ended up going there almost every night," she recalled, "and we saw Terence Stamp, Gene Shrimpton, Michael Caine, Brian Jones, and then, one night, football player turned actor Jim Brown, who recognized Victoria's father from his NFL days. I'm just sitting there thinking, I'm 17, I'm from Kansas City. How can this possibly be happening?" So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, Mal seems just as busy as he was when the Beatles toured. He joined Paul in America, then he and Paul returned to the studio and began working on 2 projects, Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine. Mal also had a bit of trouble when the girl he had been pen-palling appeared at the door a day early, and she met his wife. Oh boy, I bet Mal heard an earful from his wife that night. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. More importantly, I want to wish everyone a great day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.